Hello, welcome to the lecture on context and comparison. My name is Melissa. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today on Whadjuk Noongar Budja, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend my respect to other Indigenous people who are watching this lecture. I would also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. This lecture will have two main parts. I'll discuss context, looking at the novel Eva Luna as an example, and then move on to discussing comparison, but I'll still be bringing in the topic of context in relation to the representation of gun violence in Netflix's The Society and Emma Gonzalez's speech at the March for Our Lives protest. Before that, I want to investigate the importance of context for understanding texts. So here you will see a still from a promo video from last year's season of The Bachelor. As soon as the promotional video was released, people noticed that something was a little bit off about it. If you like, pause the video now and write some ideas about what you think could be happening here. So some of you may have noted that the women in red dresses, some of them with white details on their outfits, reminded viewers of handmaids from the TV series The Handmaid's Tale. Now, Kylie Jenner was recently called out for making this rather poignant symbol the theme for a birthday party. The costume has recently become a symbol for reproductive rights protests and women's protests the world over, partly because of the themes of the TV series and what it deals with in terms of women's rights. Now, some counter-responses to this sort of outcry, this response, have said that people are being a little overly sensitive about this video, and that red has long been a colour symbolising romance and love. But I would argue that it's not really a matter of oversensitivity, but rather of awareness of context. This year, the world has been shaken by the COVID-19 pandemic, something that caused huge changes in social behaviours in order to keep people safe and healthy. As a consequence, many companies needed to rethink marketing strategies that are no longer appropriate, so as to not send the wrong message about how to behave and not seem tone deaf to potential consumers. Hershey's Chocolate is one such company. They had to pull an ad campaign of theirs scheduled to be released around this time that encouraged people to hug and touch. Obviously, such a campaign would no longer be appropriate in a context in which we're all urged to maintain social distancing. They responded to context rapidly to send the same message of love and communication in a way that is more appropriate to the social climate, as you can see in this Mother's Day ad they released instead. So the big takeaway here is that meaning is always dependent on context. We make sense of texts based on reference to our context, and we make sense of them intertextually. Because the costumes from The Handmaid's Tale are so recognisable and so politically charged, it's hard for an image of women wearing red and white not to evoke that recognition of similarity. In this case, the meanings associated with that text are rather unfortunately tied up in the gendered meanings that we make of The Bachelor, a show that is hardly progressive in its representation of gender. So meaning is always dependent on context. Let's now look at context properly. The syllabus defines context as the environment in which a text is responded to or created. Context can include the general social, historical, and cultural conditions in which a text is responded to and created, that is to say, its context of culture, or the specific features of its immediate environment, its context of situation. We have several types of context to think about. We have the text context and the author's context when it comes to looking at context of creation, and we have the reader's context, and then there is the context of situation. Now, don't despair if this seems rather a lot of information. I'm first going to give the definition for each of these types of context, and then I'm going to illustrate these ideas with reference to the book Eva Luna. Now, you don't need to be familiar with this novel. I'm using it as an example, and I will give some background on it to help you understand it. This is more about illustrating for you the process of researching context. Eva Luna is a novel set in the later half of the 20th century in a country that is left unnamed in South America, but whose political circumstances are reminiscent of Chile. It is narrated by Eva Luna, an imaginative storyteller who later becomes a writer. The plot spans several decades of her life, from her youth growing up in a series of unusual households, to her adult relationships with a guerrilla fighter who plots against the government, and later, a political documentarian. She plays a pivotal role in helping a group of guerrilla fighters free political prisoners when she shares with them the secrets of a special kind of dough that can be used to make weapons that don't set off metal detectors and therefore can be smuggled into the prison. Here's a quote from the novel to illustrate what I mean by some of its themes. There were signs of progress in the city, and in the oil fields, contact with the hearty foreman from the north rocked the old traditions. A breeze of modernity lifted the women's skirts, but in the convent of the Little Sisters of Charity, none of that mattered. The book is rather explicitly concerned with rigid gender roles for women and rapidly shifting and often repressive political landscapes. To give us a way into looking at context in this novel, I'm going to frame the discussion with reference to a specific question from a past exam. This is from a past literature examination. It reads, "Explore how the writing of a text can be interpreted as an act of rebellion and/or empowerment." I want you to take a moment to think how this question might be encouraging us to engage with context, even though it doesn't mention that word overtly. When you are in an exam, you probably approach the question first by looking out for key terms and whether these connect to syllabus concepts. Yet, very few of the questions from the examinations last year and the year before that directly mention context. Nevertheless, examiners have noted that students needed to be able to engage with context, even when the word was not explicit, because it is a concept that is important to exploring meaning in texts. Mention of the writing of the text asks us to think about the context of text and author. What are cultural factors in the context of the text construction and/or the author's context that influence the way it's written? The question also asks us to engage with the notion of interpretation, or the ways in which meaning is made. And this is a process that is also dependent on context. So we might ask, how can readers interpret the text as rebellious or empowering in their specific context? Let's begin by looking at the context of culture. The context of creation refers to the cultural and historical environment and circumstances in which the text was created, plus the author's context. When we think about the text context, we're talking about things like the time and place it was created, and the prevailing attitudes or ideologies that may have influenced it. And not only the kinds of representations and language found in a text will be influenced by this, but also the genre and mode of text. Certain genres come out of specific cultural circumstances that make them more or less popular at certain times in history. For instance, lately we've seen the rise in popularity of things like dystopian texts, which respond to specific cultural anxieties within their certain contexts. Now, authors are mired in specific cultural contexts as well, and their perspectives on issues shape how they represent the world. They might belong, for instance, to a certain social group who occupy a specific position in society that influences how they represent the world. So when it comes to look at Eva Luna, there's a lot that we can start to unpack about its context of creation and the context of author Isabel Allende. The text's 1987 context of creation draws from the turbulent political history in Chile. particularly the 1973 coup d'etat deposing the Chilean socialist president Salvador Allende, which installed the brutal dictator Augusto Pinochet. Now, this was meaningful to Isabel Allende because, as their shared surname might suggest, she was related to the ex-president. She and her family were exiled to Venezuela, where she became a journalist for El Nacional, and therefore she has special reason to critique the politics of her time. In the earlier parts of the novel, reference is made to a regime headed up by a dictator who's later overthrown. Allende makes reference to US involvement in politics in the novel, drawing from the US support of Pinochet. The text comes out of what's called Latin American boom literature, a period out of which writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez made their name. These texts often adhere to the conventions of the genre magical realism, in which supernatural or extraordinary elements are narrated in a realist style. Women's rights struggles also inform the book, which depicts people, men and women alike, struggling with their given gender roles. The importance of motherly figures in the text could be influenced by the woman-led political movement in Argentina, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who protested about the state-sanctioned disappearance of their lost relatives during the Dirty War. Allende self-identifies as a feminist writer, and in many interviews recalls chafing against the rigid social and gender roles that were available to her in her youth. Here is a quote from an interview she gave that demonstrates what I mean. "I was born in ancient times, at the end of the world, in a patriarchal Catholic and conservative family. I would soon find out that there was a high price to pay for my freedom, and for questioning the patriarchy. But I was happy to pay it, because for every blow that I received, I was able to deliver too. So we can see here some relevant connections are to be made between context of culture, Allende's life and views, and the book's treatment of gender and politics. Let's turn now to context of reception. This refers to the context in which a text is read or viewed, and the perspective of the person viewing or reading it. While this can mean taking into account your own personal context and perspective as a reader, we can't assume that our reading of a text is a sole or authoritative one. No reader is fully objective. Our culture shapes how we think about the world. At times, you might be asked to consider how other readers respond to a text. And this can mean taking into account the way that the reader's social and historical circumstances influence how they will make meaning from the text. A reader's perspective might differ from that of another reader in their same context. Additionally, readers' reactions to text can change over time as the societies in which they live change. Now, some of you, particularly the English students, may have to compose a text during your exam. When you do so, think about your audience and the way that other readers may respond to your text in order to enrich your composition. When it comes to thinking about Eva Luna, our interpretations of this text are influenced by our own contexts. Perceptions of this text are going to be mediated by the fact that Allende is an award-winning author. So we might be inclined to read the book from the outset as a more serious meditation on its themes. We are also in a context where, aware as we are of the politicised nature of representations of gender, we're going to be sensitive to portrayals of gender in texts we read. We're likely to critique some of the more problematic representations of ethnicity in the novel, and perhaps see the book's representation of the trans woman Mimi, who is Ava's housemate, as slightly progressive or ahead of its time. It's worth noting that readers of the text at the time of its release in 1987 would have had a closer understanding of the political circumstances that inspire the book's depiction of dictatorship and revolution. As readers today, we're likely to draw more general themes from this about the need to vigilantly guard democratic ideals. We may also compare some of the radical political shifts it depicts to recent political shifts we've experienced in the US and in the UK, for instance. So based on that information we have gathered, here is an example thesis statement in response to this question along those lines. In writing Eva Luna, Isabel Allende rebels against repressive gender norms by creating an empowering representation of women, redefining their social and political roles. This statement takes into account the way the writing of this text connects to rebellion against factors in the author's context, and how it can be seen as empowering in relation to that context. It isn't the only argument we could make about this text and context, but it certainly serves to answer this question and show off our knowledge of a curriculum concept. And just to show you how we can support this from the text, here's a quote from Eva Luna that draws out some of these themes. I thought of the long ago afternoon when we first met, a boy and a girl in a crowded plaza. Even then, he was an ingrained macho, able to direct his destiny. In contrast, he believed that because I had been born a girl, I was at a disadvantage. I should accept my limitations and entrust myself to others' care. I realised that our own problems were not related in any way to the fortunes of the gorillas. Even if he achieved his dream, there would be no equality for me. For Naranjo and others like him, the people seemed to be composed exclusively of men. We women should contribute to the struggle but were excluded from decision-making and power. His revolution would not change my life in any fundamental way. As long as I lived, I would still have to make my own way. One last thing to consider is the context of situation. You can think of the context of situation as referring to the general situation that must be considered when making sense of the text, including the type of language used, the form of the text, its tone, etc. The situation could include the immediate situation of who is being addressed, in what forum and by whom, why the author or speaker is writing or speaking, and so forth. In a few moments, we will have a look at a speech and I will discuss this type of context at more length. So, onto some tips now about how to approach writing about a text in terms of context. Contexts are not uniform. For instance, there are differing opinions in our own society right now about all sorts of things: politics, social issues, religion. We tend to flatten and simplify history when we think back, but perspectives were often just as varied then as they are now. When responding to questions on context, it can help to be specific when discussing what type of reading you're conducting. If you are conducting a feminist or a class-based reading, say so. This avoids the assumption that all readers share the same reaction to a text. Take care not to equate the views of the author with those expressed by the narrator or the characters. We can't assume that they are the same. We only have access to the text itself, and not directly to the views of the author. Authors construct characters and narrators in all kinds of ways, for many reasons. An author might even have an unreliable narrator whose views are actively at odds with those expressed through the authorial voice. Identifying contextual markers in the text will help you to figure out what to say about the relationship between context and meaning. References to specific times and places, a certain type of language being used, the genre of the text, these are all clues as to a text's historical circumstances of production. The ideas explored by the text and the representations found within it are important clues as well. There are historical trends when it comes to representing parts of the world, as we can see when we think about how much representations of things like gender and sexuality have altered so much even in the past few decades. Having said that, don't confuse setting with context. The creator of a text could choose to set their text in any time and place they like. This doesn't need to be the same as the context in which the text was made. Moving along now to the second part of the lecture. Let's begin by looking at a comparison of two texts. Before I continue with my analysis of these texts, take a moment to pause the video and consider these two questions. First, what are some of the main differences between these texts? Just the first thing you've seen that seems different to you. Second, what do you think are the reasons for these differences? I'm particularly interested here in differences in context. Take a moment now to think about these questions. So, to summarise some of what I think are some of the main differences here, when we look at the first text, Archie Comics, this seems rather more innocent in tone. There's a very kind of cartoonish 1950s aesthetic to it. Perhaps the gender roles, we could say, are shown to be a little bit more traditional. We could think that it promotes a squeaky clean image of America, which reinforces the assumed moral and cultural superiority of the USA post-World War II. We also notice that here, Archie is the centre of the text, rather than the women or any other characters. The text is literally called Archie Comics. The second text has darker, sort of film noir type elements to it. There's even the word die in the scene, hinting that it will be a lot more dramatic in its approach to its subject matter. There's a sense here of peeling back the glossy image of America to reveal moral decay, corrupted politics, and rather difficult social times. And the focus is no longer on Archie alone, and it's not necessarily on his relationship with the women either. We get the sense that this is more of an ensemble text. This reflects a certain diversity in screen representation of identities, which is a very contemporary concern. By comparing and contrasting these texts, we can get a sense of shifting contexts and representations. As you might have guessed, comparison involves reading two or more texts side by side in order to determine their similarities and differences. This can involve looking for similarities and differences in genre, textual type or form, style, use of language, representations, perspectives, and context of creation or situation. Above all, it involves judging the influence of these similarities and differences in how we read the text and the kinds of meanings we might make from it. It can be hard to tell sometimes if comparison is the right technique to use in response to a question. Some exam questions will ask outright for a consideration of two texts, which makes things a lot easier. Others will ask for one or more. It's up to you to determine whether comparison will be the right strategy for approaching the question. You may well have some comparison examples prepared and ready to go. But if you think they aren't going to help you effectively respond to the question, it might be an idea to reassess your approach rather than attempting to make your ideas work with a question that asks you to look at different things. When deciding whether to use a comparative approach, the biggest thing to consider is the basis for comparison. Choose texts to compare that shares some reason for analysing them together. Can you explore representation of a particular group or setting? The use of a certain writing technique, convention or form? Or some other basis for comparison? Will exploring this aspect help you to answer the question? If you have a question that asks you to think about the perspectives that texts offer, comparing two texts with similar or differing perspectives on the same topic may well help. Once you have decided to take a comparative approach, the next step is to consider the way your response will be structured. Will you consider both texts in each paragraph, or use alternating paragraphs to discuss each text? Considering both texts in a single paragraph is tricky, so think strategically. The key here is planning. Well-planned responses consistently get higher marks. Make tight and relevant connections between texts. This approach will be rewarded more than a response that merely discusses two texts in the same essay without interconnecting them. Markers will be on the lookout for use of the appropriate language to signal a comparative response and clear transitions between discussing one text and another and comparing them. A marking key for last year's exam told markers that, quote, candidates who use clear comparative transition markers to signpost their discussion should be rewarded. For example, comparison markers include words like similarly, in the same way, equally, whereas contrast markers include things like by contrast, on the other hand, in a different way. You have limited time to discuss two texts, so if you want to write with economy but depth, work on being as precise as possible in your use of language. I want to give you an example of comparison of text in response to a question, to give you a sense of the things you can discuss. To get us into this, here's a question from a past English exam which asks students to engage with how genre and context are linked. The question asks, compare how two texts of different genres respond to the concerns of the same time period. So we know we're dealing here with the syllabus concept of genre. And the question explicitly asks us to use comparison to explore this. But it's important to note that, despite the absence of the word itself, deep analysis of context is going to be involved, because that is the only way we can understand how texts are shaped by and respond to the anxieties of the time in which they're made. I'm going to approach this question by discussing Emma Gonzalez's 2018 speech at the March for Our Lives protest and 2019's Netflix TV show, The Society. Let's first turn our attention to the speech. This was made at the March for Our Lives protest in March 2018 after the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Florida. Gonzalez was a student at the school. Play the speech now. If you like, you can pause the lecture now and play the entire clip, noting how you respond to Gonzalez's use of silence to convey her points. As a genre of form, the speech has certain conventions. It is an oratory delivered by a person to a specific audience, often about a certain topic, on a special occasion, or in response to an event. Speeches use strategies like tone and structure to communicate a message. It is useful to discuss context of situation. This speech was prompted by a horrible tragedy. It was given to an audience of protesters at a march organised specifically to call for a political response to gun violence. It takes place in a context in which youth are increasingly coming together to fight against the political status quo. Interestingly, Gonzalez clearly chose to play up a military angle to the speech, wearing a shade of green on her jacket that is associated with the armed forces. Her tone suggests that she is in a state of mourning, but it is largely an angry tone. She is using her tone of voice to challenge the political context. She uses a mix of personal testimony, calls for political change, and eulogy that is to say, a speech delivered at a funeral, to convey the message. Her politically rebellious message is that much more effective delivered by someone openly mourning and testifying to the trauma she has experienced. But the most interesting thing about this speech is not the words. If you watch it in full, it's quite difficult to watch through that silence. People are visibly uncomfortable on screen. You yourself may have felt rather uncomfortable watching it. Her deployment of silence is a strong rhetorical strategy used to comment on the political silencing of dissent and the literal silencing of her classmates who were killed. Let's contrast this with a more recently produced text. 2019's Netflix original production, The Society, to see how the change of genre changes the way this text responds to some of the same social concerns. I've provided a URL of the trailer here. Please pause the lecture now and watch the trailer of The Society so that you are able to get an understanding of what it is all about. To give you a firmer idea of what happens here, a group of teens return from a school excursion to find their small town deserted of all other people. It soon emerges that the town is surrounded by impenetrable forest, so they can't leave it, and they must fend for themselves and construct a new society to survive. It is hinted that their isolation is a punishment to their parents and the town, who have committed some mysterious wrongdoing. The Society is a TV show, of course, and not a speech. As a genre of form, the TV series favours the development of multiple serialised narratives. It has the scope to develop many characters and themes. The show combines elements of the disaster text, which focuses on ideas of survival and rebuilding, looking critically at social structures and human vice, and the generic conventions of the teen drama, which explore the idea of growing up, often under trying circumstances. These typically incorporate tones of the literary Bildungsroman, or the coming-of-age narrative. It's part of that trend we've seen lately in teen dramas, where shows like Euphoria, Riverdale, and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina go a bit darker in their representation of the trials and tribulations of high school life. The young people who must band together in the absence of adults and established law officials struggle to create a fair and equitable society, and guns become a major issue when one of them is murdered by a gunshot. They rehearse a debate among themselves, which has by now become a political staple. Do they allow access to guns for self-defence for everyone? Or do they forbid access to them for the sake of common safety? We can compare these two texts, both of them in the form of genres that really speak to mass audiences and similar demographics, to see that they both respond to the current political context and to gun control and violence. They enter into debates over gun control in a context in which mass shootings happen so often in the US that they are almost routine. While the US is the only country where this happens so often, the political situation is such that large associations wield a great deal of political power in squashing laws on gun control. Both texts centralise the experience of youth, positioning young people as powerful agents of political change. So in response to that exam question, we could look at these texts and formulate an argument about how they deploy the conventions of their respective genres in order to address concerns about gun control and political status quo in the context of their creation. Something you could do is think about the context of 2020 and the major world events that have happened lately. COVID-19 and the killing of George Floyd, leading to worldwide resurgences in Black Lives Matter protests. What texts have you seen that respond to these events? For instance, you might explore John Boyega's recent speech, in which his tone conveyed both his passion and his impatience with the seemingly glacial pace of political and social change around this matter. You could compare this to a documentary like Netflix's 13th, which explores systematic racism in the US prison system. I want to leave you today with a few last-minute tips for the exam. The first is to be prepared, research the context of texts and authors and creators in order to be prepared to make use of that knowledge in the exam. The second is to choose the right tools and approach. You need to choose the text and argument that will best address the questions given. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, conserve your energy and take care of yourself mentally and physically. We often forget to do these things, leading into stressful situations. Thanks very much for watching this lecture today, and all the very best with your exams and your studies.